Hello, nice to meet you in person, or at least face to face officially.
Yeah, we'll go with face to face officially. That was
Yeah. Thank you so much for being willing to come on and make your case for early dates for the New Testament. And before we dive right in, I'll go ahead and start by introducing you to my audience.
thank you.
Yeah, of course. Dr. Jonathan Bernier holds a PhD in religious studies from McMaster University with a focus in early Christianity. He teaches at Regis College in Toronto, which is part of the Toronto School of Theology, and he also serves as the executive director of the Lonergan Research Institute housed at Regis, and Rethinking the Dates of the New Testament is his third book. Is that all correct?
That is correct.
Awesome. And
Except
yeah.
it's Bernier, not Bernier.
Oh, Bernier. Okay, I'm sorry about
No worries.
And where and when can people find your book?
So it's supposed to be released next week, and as far as I know, everything sounds like it's on track. Amazon directly from Baker Press, those places would be carrying it. Yeah, those would probably be the main retailers. Yeah.
Okay, awesome.
I know there's a Logos edition. I think it's also coming out next week, and so.
Oh, okay, great. And it's called Rethinking the Dates of the New Testament. Correct?
Yes. Yep.
Well, that's exciting. I can't wait to have the time to actually read the entire book myself. It's definitely one of the first books on my reading list for the summer. So yeah, as I was perusing it so far, it's been very interesting, and I'm excited to read the whole thing thoroughly.
Well, and I hope it helps if your own. I know you work on dating issues related to Luke Acts, I believe it is, and so I hope it's helpful for you because I wrote the book. Both, I became convinced that earlier dating was stronger than late dating or even middle dating, but I tried as much as possible to write the book so that anyone could find it a useful introduction to the relevant material, to help them get oriented into the discussions. So I hope that's, you find that helpful.
This is actually a perfect book for me because I'm hoping to write my master's thesis next spring on the data of Luke and Acts. And right now I'm actually writing a paper that's arguing that a little bit based on, I'm looking at like some early quotations of Luke and Acts and trying to come up with like a late date, the last possible date for Luke and Acts.
Excellent. So sort of work that Andrew Gregory was doing, and that and I mean that's incredibly important, and I think that's a perfect MA thesis because it really gets you into the material, really gets you thinking about what constitutes use, what constitutes, as opposed to similar sounding documents or these sort of technical issues. I mean, I'm sure these are things you're wrestling with, but I think it's exactly at the MA level is the best place to wrestle with those sort of questions.
Yeah. It's so far it's been fascinating. My paper is due on Saturday, so I've been working on it, and I should have it done in time. But yeah, it's the more I research it, the more I'm finding, I guess, interesting quotations that seem like they almost work, and it's just I'm trying to wrestle through them to make sure that they're definitely quotations. So yeah.
Yeah, no, exactly, and that's where it gets difficult because you get things that are very, very, very close, but are they actually Luke? You know this, of course, and and that's where it gets complicated. And one of the reasons that I'm happy myself not to actually do reception criticism, I mean that's relevant to my work, of course. In that obviously Luke can't date later than any questionable citation or quotation of it, but I'm not concerned to the same extent with figuring out exactly when it was first being used or our first earliest example of it. Earliest extant examples isn't my main focus. So it's horribly difficult work, and I appreciate those who do focus on it. So,
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Well, let me ask my first question, which is a more general question, which is what drew you to the topic of the dates of the books in the New Testament? And in your opinion, why does it matter when the New Testament books were written?
okay, so with the first half of that, the first thing I'm going to say is um, my story is a bit of a plug for why it's a good idea to save all your notes when you go through things like comprehensive exams, because this actually started with notes for my comprehensive exams for my PhD. For those who aren't familiar with the PhD process in North America, you typically do some coursework and then you spend a year or so doing what are called qualifying exams or comprehensive exams, depending upon where you're at. And so when I was doing mine during my PhD, I sat down one afternoon in the summer after my first year as I was getting ready for comps, and I just said to myself, just for my own sake, not for any question they're going to ask, but just to organize things in my own head, I really have to make a list of the order of the books, just arrange them chronologically, just to help organize my own thoughts. And I figured that would be an afternoon's work, and it turned into a minor obsession because I realized it was so much more complicated than infinitely more complicated than I had realized. And so throughout my PhD, throughout my dissertation, whenever I needed to take a break from writing dissertation, but still wanted to stay academical, in sort of academic work, I came back to this, to the point that one day I wasn't even thinking of publishing. I just mentioned to my doctoral supervisor, oh, I've got 20,000 words of notes on the dates of the New Testament. And I still remember his eyes went wide and he said, that's your second book, and it turned out to be my third book. And which was actually right. I mean, I wasn't ready. I didn't have the experience yet to do it as a second book. I needed some more experience to really get there. But yeah, it really just started almost as an accident, just notes getting out of hand. And so then why is it important? I think, on one level, there's certain aspects of it that are not crucial, but I do think where it becomes crucial are things, all of our talk of the relationship between Paul and the Gospels assumes that Paul came before the Gospels. But if one or more of the Gospels was written before Paul, that becomes a different sort of question. The question then becomes, does Paul know this Gospel? Does Paul, if Paul doesn't know it, why doesn't he know it if it already exists? So it opens up these new questions, and it opens up different possibilities of doctrinal development. If there's a big difference if the relationship between James and the Pauline epistles, temporally becomes, very significant. If James is a witness to a very early form of Christianity that presupposes Paul, that's very different than, say, Dale Allison saying that it represents second century Ebionite Christianity. These are very different understandings of the trajectory of Christianity. So I would tend to say, I think the dating of it in itself isn't necessarily crucial in its own right, but the entailments that come out in terms of doctrinal development, I think, become very important. I mean, you've seen this in your own professor's work, Doug Campbell, where I disagree with him on certain things, but I think his basic insight that we can't talk about development in Paul's thought if we don't know the basic order of the letters. I think that basic insight is 100% sound. Even if I might disagree with some of the details of how he then arranges the letters, nonetheless, I can't assail that basic insight. So I hope that helps.
So if some of the Gospels were written before Paul wrote his letters, would this then change how we think about some of Paul's, like, for example, when Paul quotes Jesus's words at the Last Supper, would you think that that's like a quotation from the Gospel of Mark instead of like quoting oral tradition?
I actually haven't thought about that particular example. before, and the reason I say that is I want to go back and see
Mhm.
much more clearly what degree of verbatim agreement is there,
Yeah.
those sort of issues. But um, I would at least be open to it. I would certainly be open to the possibility that a lot of what we say is oral tradition, is evidence of oral tradition, is actually evidence of relatively early textualization of the traditions. I mean, part of the problem is we don't, by definition, we don't have the oral tradition, which means we don't actually know. We don't know what the oral tradition contained, and that means we can't really compare it to the textual tradition. I mean, we don't know if the oral tradition contained 99% of what's in the Gospels or 10%. I mean, we just don't know. That's an unfortunate limitation of the data. The very nature of oral tradition means it's not written down unless it's part of the textual evidence. So
Mhm.
it's. I don't think there's any way, absent a time machine, no way to get around that limitation. So
Yeah, yeah, definitely. That makes sense. So then now getting into the dates that you argue for the books of the New Testament, can I start by asking you when would kind of the majority of scholars date the Gospels, and then when would you date the Gospels?
so the majority of scholars would tend to put the Gospels between about 70 and 100. I think probably a majority would put Mark just before 70, either just before or just after 70, but around 70-ish. Matthew maybe around, let's say, 80-ish, 75 to 80. Luke around, say, 85. John around, say, 90. Uh, I would, although I would say actually, that really once you put them after 70, the difference between 85 and 90 is hard to figure out. I'm not sure there's any real basis for it. But the I would put um, I would argue that all four of the Gospels were written for 70, although I would acknowledge John is the most likely to be written after 70. Or to put it negatively, the evidence for a pre-70 John is, I think, the weakest of the four, and I would acknowledge that. But I think that certainly for Matthew and Mark and Luke, I think the evidence is fairly strong that a pre-70 date makes much more sense than a post-70 date.
Okay, and can you clarify the importance of the year 70 when dating the Gospels?
That's actually a really good question, because that's the sort of thing that I tend to take for granted. And one thing I've learned from working with especially first year uh, students. Now, first year for us means first year MDiv, not first year undergrad, but still, very often zero experience with New Testament. Is I just assume things like 70 is important, and they're sitting there going, what? But the but 70 is important because that's the date that the temple is destroyed. And so really the question that comes up with all the Gospels, the central question, I think, for the dating of the Gospel, the central question for the dating of the Gospels is, do they know the destruction of the temple or not? Because if they know the temple's been destroyed, if they know the temple has been destroyed in living memory, then they're clearly post 70. I mean, there's no question about that. I mean, I would certainly concede that to my colleagues who date the Gospels after 70. If they do know that, if any gospel that knows that any text that knows that must post date 70, I would just challenge whether or not the Gospels know that. And so yeah, that's the significance of 70.
And here we get into the kind of difficult question about whether they know the destruction of the temple, because Jesus prophesies the destruction of the temple multiple times throughout the Synoptic Gospels. So, is in order to put the Gospels before 70, do you have to kind of take a supernatural stance that Jesus predicted the future? Is it kind of like a religious? Do you kind of box yourself into a religious position by putting the Gospels before 70?
I don't think you box yourself into a religious position. Now, having said that, certainly, um, the argument that these statements about the destruction of the temple could predate 70 is probably more amenable to a traditional sort of religious position than one that says they must post-date 70. But I think it's entirely plausible. The temple had been destroyed before. The temple had been desecrated during the Maccabean period. There have been various instances throughout the Second Temple period where the future of the temple looked like it was in question. So that someone in around 30 CE would see the all the oppression from the Romans, see how bad things were starting to get, and conclude that this was going to eventually result in the destruction of the temple. I don't think that's at all implausible, especially since, again, it's in the tradition, it's in the scriptures, this language of destruction and desecration of the temple. The Gospels are clearly drawn upon that scriptural tradition. So I don't see anything in any of the Gospels that requires knowledge specifically of the events of 70. Obviously, I'm going to use an obvious example here, but obviously if it says, if the Gospel said, and then Jesus said, Titus will come along and burn down the temple, and then 10 years later he'll be emperor. Well, then, yeah, that's a pretty strong evidence that it was written sometime after those events. But it's not that, there's nothing near that level of the precision. So.
Yeah, and are there any clues in the way that the synoptics predict the destruction of the temple? Are there any clues maybe that they didn't have a knowledge of the temple actually being destroyed?
Well, I think specifically in Matthew and Mark, the Gospels of Matthew and Mark very much want to connect the destruction of the temple with the parousia, with the return of Jesus. They talk about how when these things happen, the Son of Man will appear, this sort of stuff. That sort of Christian language is very standard for the return, for what's known as the second coming. Well, as far as we know, that didn't happen in 70. The eschaton, the parousia didn't happen in 70. So, and of course, Christians have then reinterpreted those passages. But it seems to me that it's much easier to imagine that these things were written before 70 than after 70. If they're written after 70, I would expect to see the sort of minimum, I would expect to see the sort of reinterpretation happening, the sort of work happening of saying why the parousia didn't happen at that point, or why so I would say, yes, I can conceive these as post-70 texts, but they make a lot more sense to me as pre-70, and I don't see anything else that necessitates a post-70 text. So I'm quite happy saying they're pre-70.
Very interesting. So, do you in the Gospel of John? I would have to double check the specific passage, but Jesus predicts. He kind of says that someone will not pass away before he comes again. I might be.
Yeah, that's specifically the beloved disciple in chapter 21.
Yeah. And then the author kind of clarifies that Jesus didn't say, the author, I might be wording this poorly, but the author clarifies that Jesus didn't say that the beloved disciple would not die until Jesus comes, but rather if the beloved disciple doesn't die. And so basically what I'm trying to say is, it seems to me like there are maybe hints in the Gospel of John that people were expecting Jesus to come back, but then he didn't come back when they expected they expected him to, and so now the author is kind of trying to explain that away. And I know you argue for a pre-70 date for John, but do you think that in the Synoptic Gospels they would kind of probably if Jesus really did predict kind of the parousia happening at the destruction of the temple, do you think that the Synoptic Gospels would kind of give some more theological explanation of what this meant if they were written after the destruction of the
I
temple.
mean, I think you'd be more likely to see that. I mean, same as you have that, and you have this, this language in Matthew that some of those standing here will not see, will still be here when the Son of Man. This sort of language seems to assume that the parousia is going to happen within the lifetime of people who are there, and I think John 21 does as well. Now John 21 gets a little bit complicated simply because I think most biblical scholars now would agree that John 21 is secondary to John. I'm not actually convinced. I think John 21 maybe. I think the argument for it being original is stronger than is often thought. But I do need to say, as a matter of as a matter of integrity, that the majority of my colleagues would probably say it's secondary, and their reasons are not unreasonable. I can't say that they're wrong. So so that makes a difference. That does allow the possibility that John 21 was written much later than the rest of the gospel. So we have to be a little careful about that. But yeah, you do see, you see in John 2 as well, this Jesus says, I'll destroy this temple and raise it up in 3 days. And then the statement of after his death, after his resurrection, the disciples realized he was talking about his body, not the temple. So again, you see some sort of effort to rethink these traditions that you don't see in the synoptics at all. So
Yeah, very interesting. Okay, so
and this I want to clarify, these are part of the reasons that I would say, even though I do ultimately opt for a pre-70 John, I would acknowledge that these things are some of the reasons that I would say a post-70 John is the strongest of the three. It's these sort of things.
Yeah.
That I can see a very cogent argument being made. As I said, I ultimately disagree with it, but I can see it being made.
So to clarify, you're saying that in the Gospel of John, it clarifies that it's that when Jesus says, "Destroy the temple, and I'll raise it again in 3 days," the Gospel of John clarifies that that's Jesus's body, and possibly the reason could be if John were written after 70, it becomes apparent that the temple in Jerusalem is not being rebuilt, and so hypothetically, he reinterpreted that as being Jesus's body.
Yeah, and I think that's that argument's been put forward. Now, I tend to think that the reinterpretation of the tradition, I think clearly Jesus said something. The most reasonable interpretation is that there's a very early tradition, probably comes from Jesus, where he says, "I'll destroy this temple and raise it up in 3 days." And at some point that becomes reinterpreted as a reference to his body. Now, Jesus may have even originally meant that, and the disciples eventually get it right. But for me, the most reasonable place for that is in the aftermath of the first Easter, that early period. It seems that the apostles are rethinking all of the tradition, everything they received from Hebrew scripture, everything they've received from Jesus is being rethought. That to me is the most reasonable place for that rethink, that reinterpretation that Jesus saying. But having said that, if someone says, no, it makes sense in light of the destruction of the temple, I can't refute that. It's not an unreasonable hypothesis. I just think my understanding is probably better. That's all.
Yeah, that makes sense. So one of the things that you do is in your book, you show that if you can date Acts, then you can kind of push all of the synoptic gospels earlier than Acts, based on kind of the synoptic problem and the order that the gospels were written. Can you kind of explain that argument? How does the date that Acts was written affect the date that the synoptic gospels were written?
So the first thing I would say is that's most clear for Mark and Luke. I think nowadays, so let's start with Luke Acts. We'll just start at the very basics. I think everyone agrees virtually that Luke and Acts have the same author. At the very least, even if they have different authors, that Acts is intentionally, or I'll rephrase it, that Acts is very much aware of Luke, even if it's written by someone else. 50 years later, it's intentionally situating itself as a as a sequel to Luke. I think virtually everyone would agree with that. Either it was a sequel or an intended or a second volume. So that means Luke is earlier. I mean, it could be 6 months earlier, but it's earlier than Acts. And then I think we're now at a point where I think virtually every New Testament scholar working today, I think, would agree that Luke used Mark. So we can there have a very clear statement that Luke is earlier than Acts, Mark is earlier than Luke. Again, they could be very close together. In theory, that could have all happened in 3 years, but you still have a relative ordering there. Matthew is clearly, most people would agree, Matthew also used Mark. Where it gets a little bit more tricky is there's disagreements about Matthew's relationship to Luke. Your professor Mark Goodacre, of course, would argue, and I think he's right, that Luke used Matthew. But that's the majority. I think more scholars would probably still hold to the idea that Matthew used an independent document queue. But I basically say that, look, the bottom line is that Matthew coming before Luke is necessitated by the Farrer hypothesis that Goodacre argues, which is probably the second most strongly adhered to view now, and is compatible with the Q hypothesis that is the dominant view still. So that the assumption of Mark being written before Matthew being written before Luke, and then Luke being used by Acts is the strongest relative ordering out there. Now, I will acknowledge, yes, there are people who are very strongly arguing that Matthew used Luke and Luke, these. So I will acknowledge that with Matthew's the odd man out that's the most likely to not fit into that ordering. But that I do think I think it's very strong with Mark, Luke, and Acts, and reasonable with Matthew to have in that relative ordering.
Great, thank you. And so if we can kind of date the synoptics through Acts, where would you date Acts on the timeline?
Right, and that's I've always kept going back to the ending of Acts, and the ending of Acts, for those who don't know, Acts spends a full quarter of the book is dedicated to Paul's legal troubles that result with him in Rome. And he's made this appeal to the emperor. He ends up in Rome. This is a full quarter of the book. And then his hearing before the emperor never happens. We just hear that he's in Rome, hanging out in a rented house for 2 years. And that's it. And to me, that seems a really weird ending. And, I've gone through all the different arguments, and I acknowledge, of course, fully that there are different arguments to explain this, but to me, none of them are as compelling as simply Luke doesn't say what happens next because it hasn't happened yet. It just simply hasn't happened yet. He's, and really the only reason to exclude that is the assumption that Luke knows the destruction of the temple. But if Luke doesn't know the destruction of the temple, then it's probably the easiest explanation for the end of Acts. And so that would put, that those 2 years in Rome were probably from about 60 through 62. So, I would say Acts was probably written was probably completed not long after 62 or in 62. And then, yes, that would put, in my mind, the synoptics, especially, certainly Mark and Luke, and probably Matthew earlier.
Interesting. So one question that just came to my mind is, do you think there's any chance that the reason Acts was written when it was, if it was written in 60 to 62, was to maybe be an apology for Paul to help with the verdict of the trial?
That is one of the arguments out there for, it may even be the dominant argument for an early Acts. I tend to stay away from those sort of questions in the book. I'm just interested in what are the best. I try to focus on the date, not the why of these texts. And that's because I don't want to confuse issues. I don't want people to reject a particular why that I've come up with that isn't necessarily connected to that when, because you could reject that why. You could reject that it was defense of Paul and still say it's probably written around 62. These are related, but not, one doesn't entail the other. So, well, I guess it has to be the argument of defense basically does assume a date around that period, but it doesn't necessitate it. So, so yes, I would say that that's definitely a possible explanation for Acts.
Interesting. So, and I've thought about the strange way that Acts ends too, and it just seems so obvious when you're reading it that it's just kind of leaving off where it does because it's basically caught up to the present. The tricky thing for me is that there are other examples where works like this have kind of an unexpected ending. Maybe most obviously the Gospel of Mark kind of has, ends right with an angel telling the women that Jesus is resurrected, and then it says the women ran away and they were afraid and they didn't say anything to anyone. So I kind of think of that as like an analogy of like a Christian work that has like an unexpected ending. And I feel like when people think hard enough, they can always think of maybe a theological reason for why the author ended it in that unexpected place. So,
oh, absolutely. I mean, there are certainly alternative explanations. I just don't think they're as compelling. Anyway, sorry, I cut you off there.
No, yeah. So you're saying that you're open to the possibility. You just think it's less probable based on when it ends. You think the most probable explanation is just that's caught up to the present. Okay.
I mean, ultimately, this is what history is about, right? I mean, you figure out what's certain. I mean, Luke has to have been written before the first unequivocal reference to it. There's no question. And then you ask, okay, well, and it also had to have been written after Jesus's death, obviously, and the events of the first Easter, obviously. So you say, okay, I have this range of let's say about 120 years, because really, it's around 150 that we have unequivocal evidence of Luke, at least from what I can tell. I mean, if you come up with something better, if you come up with an earlier example, that's great. But at least standard of research where it is now, we would say it's maybe about 150. And then we say where in that 120 years makes the most sense. And, and that, I think for me, somewhere around 62-ish makes the most sense. But yeah, if we discovered that Acts was written in 120, if there was unequivocal evidence, well, I mean, I would simply say, okay, well, I'll revise my my date, But given what we do have, that seems like the best explanation to me.
Some scholars argue, and actually both of my professors, Dr. Goodacre and Dr. Campbell, subscribe to this position, that Luke used Josephus's Antiquities of the Jews, which would put Luke and Acts after around 93 CE. Yep. So what do you think about that theory that Luke and Acts are kind of relying or show a knowledge of Josephus's Antiquities of the Jews?
Well, I think it's in the category of possible, but I think it creates a lot of problems. I mean, the standard, one of the strongest passages for supporting this is that Luke and Josephus both mention the same rebels, Photius, Judas, and the Egyptian. But they mention them in different order. They put them in different orders, and this has been for 200 years been seen as held up as one of the big examples of Luke making a historical error, that he puts things in a different order from Josephus. Well, when you have to rely upon a place where he clearly, diverges from Josephus to make your argument, that's a little problematic. I mean, yes, of course, the synoptics always diverge from each other. Sources often differ, But in the case of the synoptics, you have clear verbatim agreements. You don't have anything like that. All you have is these contexts of these contacts describing the same historical figures. And there's key differences in the descriptions. I think makes much more sense to just simply say they're both referring to prominent figures of that period who are remembered precisely because they're prominent, not because one's copying the other. I think even more to the point, I think if we relied upon the evidence that Luke used Josephus is so absent in, there's so little and basically no almost verbatim agreement. There's very little in terms of verbal parallels. It's primarily content. If we saw that level of relatively low agreement when assessing what texts know the Gospel of Luke, we would not say this knows the Gospel of Luke. We would say it might at best. It might know a proto-Luke, it might know something related to Luke, but it certainly does, so we certainly can't say it says Luke. So there's some methodological issues here that I think we're operating with a much lower expectation of proof than when we work with the reception of the Gospels.
Yeah,
that's problematic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I see that, in my own research, I've seen what you're saying, where they have like a very high, sometimes they have a very high, I guess, a very high bar before they say something is a quotation of Luke and Acts. The one that I've really been looking into is when the author of the pastoral epistles in 1 Timothy 5:18, he says, the worker is worthy of his wages, which matches Luke 10:7. And the counter theories, other than him quoting Luke, that I've seen is that maybe he's quoting an adage at the time, but there's no evidence of this being an adage, or they say maybe he's quoting source Q. There's lots of different theories, but yeah, it seems like they definitely are using like a lower bar with Josephus's, saying that Luke used Josephus's Antiquities of Jude.
I think 1 Timothy 5:18 is the perfect example that if we accept the bar, as you put it, if you accept such a low bar that's being used to show Josephus's or Luke's use of Josephus, if we accept that bar is an acceptable level, set an acceptable level, then we have to conclude that 1 Timothy 5:18 is citing Luke. There's no way you could hold the same exact criteria for judging use of a text and conclude otherwise. Now, having said that, as someone who works with chronology, that's not necessarily a huge problem for someone who wants to do a late date, because all they have to say is 1 Timothy dates into the 2nd century, Luke dates a little bit earlier in the 2nd century. That would still be a possible conclusion, but I don't think you can say that Luke used Josephus and then also say 1 Timothy 5:18 doesn't know Luke.
Yeah.
I don't think you can say both of those things at the same time and be using any sort of consistent methodology.
Yeah. And you talk in your book about assigning dates to the Gospels by looking at the evidence from authorial biography. Can you kind of describe what authorial biography is, and then how it plays into the dates of the synoptic Gospels?
So what I look at, and I'm always very clear that authorial biography tends to be, for the Gospels, some of the least strongest material, but simply look at, okay, this Gospel is historically attributed to Mark. What do we know about Mark? And do we know enough about Mark that this allows us to potentially make statements about when he might have written the Gospels? It really is a very limited utility in the Gospels. It becomes very important with Paul, because really dating Paul's letters is really all about when in his life do you situate it. even someone like Douglas Campbell, who doesn't want to use Acts, ultimately is still looking at, okay, what evidence of Paul's biography can we glean from Paul's letters? I mean, he's still trying to build Paul's biography in a chronological sense to date the letters. He's just putting less weight on Acts than I would, but the same basic method is, I think, basically the same. So with gospel, in terms of the gospels, I say, okay, well, there is a tradition, very early tradition, that Peter is a source for Mark, and that Mark wrote it shortly after Peter and him were in Rome together, and Mark was still in Rome. So I simply ask, when do we know when Mark and Peter might have been in Rome, and when is that is that consistent with what the dates that we can see on other grounds? And since I can plausibly put them there in the early 40s, and that's consistent with other data, that's part of why I would favor the early 40s for Mark.
Interesting. Okay, so do you think that, or do you think we can, I guess, have confidence regarding the authorship of the synoptic gospels? Do you think that, or do you take into account the authorship a lot when dealing with like Matthew, for example, or Luke, or do you kind of just leave that up in the air?
Well, I would say of the three synoptics, we can be most confident of Luke. I'm fairly confident that someone named Mark wrote the Gospel of Mark. Where I'm less confident is, we have a number of references to this figure Mark and John Mark in the New Testament, and Christian history has always identified them as the same person. That the Mark who wrote the Gospel of Mark, the John Mark of Acts, and the Mark of the Pauline epistles and the Petrine epistle, 1 Peter, are all the same person. I'm less convinced that they are necessarily the same person. We know that early Christians often conflated people with the same name, and our references to these people are so fleeting that they could be the same person, but if I discovered it was up to 4 different men who were named Mark, that also wouldn't entirely surprise me. So, I'm fairly confident that someone named Mark wrote the Gospel of Mark, according to Mark. But which Mark he is, I'm less convinced, I'm less certain of. Same with John. I'm very convinced that someone named John wrote the Gospel of John. Was it John the Elder? Was it John the Apostle? John, probably not John who wrote Revelation, but there's so many different people named John. It's even been argued that John Mark wrote it. So Matthew is the one I'm least convinced of.
Yeah, and that would, I'm assuming that would have to do with Papias talking about Matthew writing about the oracles of Jesus, or the sayings of Jesus in Aramaic. Is that right?
In Hebrew, but in Hebrew language, but most people assume that that's Aramaic. So I've come around on that. My former colleague when I was at St. Francis Xavier University, Ken Penner, he's written an article recently that really argued strongly that Hebrew language is Hebrew and not Aramaic, and that's brought me around. But it really doesn't make that big a difference for what I'm trying to do. But for me, the real issue is that it does seem strange to me that Matthew would take the story of Levi the tax collector and change it into a story of his own call by Jesus. For those who don't know, Mark has this story of Levi being called, and then Matthew turns it into Matthew. It seems really it's a story of Matthew being called. It seems weird to me that the historical Matthew would do that. But having said that, I can't exclude the possibility. Maybe Matthew found this story and said, hey, you know what, this is close enough to my own experience, I'll just change the name. I mean, I can't rule that out, but it does seem a little weird to me.
Yeah. So then regarding the Gospel of John, do you You mentioned that a lot of scholars would say that the Gospel or that John 21 was not originally part of the Gospel of John. Do you think that the author of John claims to be an eyewitness?
Um,
Or do you think that that affects the dating at all? The eyewitness claim, or do you use that?
well, we do have the eyewitness claim.
Mhm.
Um, the end of 20, I believe. I'm just going by memory here, but I believe
Yeah,
we
yeah,
have the
yeah.
eyewitness claim at the end of 20. So
Mhm,
we'd still have the eyewitness claim.
mhm,
The extent to which one would want to, uh, spiritualize that or to turn it into a fictional claim, obviously makes a difference for how one interprets it. But I
mhm,
think, you know, John is this really interesting animal. Whenever I teach on John, I always tell my intro students, it's it's got some weird things going on. It's the only gospel that explicitly claims eyewitness, uh, to be an eyewitness of Jesus. It's the only gospel that explicitly presents Jesus as is somehow part of the Godhead in some way, and it's also the only gospel that explicitly says that Jesus was flesh. So it's this really weird, there's a lot of things that are, or it says the Word was flesh, but makes clear Jesus was, and so there's this fascinating combination of material. I mean, my dissertation, my MA and my dissertation were both on John, so I could go on for John forever, especially the prologues. That's what I did my MA on.
mhm,
But the but the eyewitness, I mean, I am fairly confident that the bulk of John was written by an eyewitness, but I wouldn't stake chronological judgments on that because it is legitimately controvertible. My colleagues who disagree are raising legitimate issues. And so
mhm,
I can't say that they're wrong. Yeah.
mhm. Do you think that the same person who authored the Gospel of John was also the author of the Johannine epistles?
I would tend to lean that way, especially 1 John, which is so clearly stylistically. I'd be more open to 2 and 3 John being a second author, but
Mhm.
I would tend to lean to all 4 being the same author. I mean, I know that's kind of especially in the last couple of years, has come under attack, but I I still think it's the best explanation of what we're seeing in the material.
The interesting thing to me about First John, because I've heard arguments against the Gospel of John, of it actually claiming to be by an eyewitness, especially in John 21. The interesting thing about First John, though, is, in my opinion, if it is written by the same author, he seems to start his epistle by claiming to be an eyewitness. He says, like, what we have heard and seen with our eyes and touched with
And
our hands.
touched, yeah.
Yeah,
I mean, not only an eyewitness, but a hand witness.
yeah.
So I think part of that is related rhetorically to
Mhm.
he very much wants to, very much what part of what he's doing there is to express the enfleshment of Jesus, that Jesus came in the flesh, not just as a spirit, not as a, this sort of language that develops. And he, um, but yeah, it is interesting that he uses that language of we touched, is a very, um, you wouldn't see a medieval writer saying that, unless it was in highly spiritualized, unless it was a really spiritual work or something. You wouldn't see late patristic writers or really anyone beyond the first generation, using that sort of, I guess maybe in some very Eucharistic material, but in just general
Mhm.
talk, you wouldn't see that. And so it is a very interesting. It's a very interesting claim. It's again, it's one of those claims that certainly makes more sense as someone who literally did touch Jesus as someone who didn't. Yeah. So
Yeah. And one question that just came to my mind was, if if the author is doing something theological by emphasizing the fleshly nature of Jesus, then is it possible that he is, I guess, writing kind of against the Gnostic idea of Jesus just being like a spiritual being? And if that's the case, would that kind of push John later if he's writing against Gnosticism?
well, I think he's. I mean, I think certainly. 1 John at the very least is certainly dealing with something that looks much like what we would later come to know as asceticism. I think part of the problem with this, when I started this, certainly when I started thinking about it, I very strongly thought, okay, we can connect these things to Docetism that will let us get some sense. But the more I looked into it, let's grant that 1 John is very clearly referring to Docetism. But when did Docetism start? I mean, we have a sense of maybe when it flourishes, but when did it start? We don't actually know when that started as a movement within Christianity. So this greatly, undercuts our ability to use it for establishing the date of anything. It'd be much easier if we knew that John was referring to the Valentinian Gospel of Truth, and it was definitely refuting that, line by line, and then we can definitely, Gospel of Truth, if it is by Valentinius or one of his followers, probably can't date much earlier than 140-ish, then suddenly, that's a different conversation, but that's not what we have. So.
Yeah. So can you go into, I guess, what do you think is your strongest piece of evidence regarding the date of the Gospel of John?
The Gospel of John, ultimately is the weakest for dating purposes in general. Let me rephrase it. The Gospel of John in general lacks the sort of really good chronological indicators that we'd love to have. Ultimately, the strongest is the reference, I think, in chapter 5 to where John talks about certain parts of the architecture of the temple, the Pool of Solomon, Siloam, as still in the present tense, as standing. And I acknowledge fully, of course, that present tense in and of itself is not enough to establish that it happens, that he's writing at exactly a time when that happened. But I think Dan Wallace made a really strong argument 30 plus years ago to show that grammatically that makes the most sense, that he's writing at a time when the pool is still still standing, and not just the pool, but the porticles. It mentions specifically the porticles are there, and so this makes most sense before the destruction. But I will grant that is, of the 4 gospels, the weakest argument for a pre-70 date. And I would certainly not present it as a knockdown, there's no alternative date. I would put in the category of, given that this is here, a pre-70 date, I think, makes more sense than post, but not a definite. So
correct me if I'm wrong, but wasn't the Pool of Siloam destroyed in 70, and then we've now rediscovered it in the archaeological description, or the description in the Gospel of John matches what we have found. Is that correct?
It's a little more complicated than just in that there are some debates about the identification, but I think that's basically I would say that probably the majority of people who have worked on the pool would probably be comfortable with that sort of description. That we found something that's more or less in the right area, more or less close enough to this, the description that we could, that it makes the identification, reasonable. So yeah, I think that's a fairly reasonable overview.
Okay, yeah, very interesting. Yeah, I remember reading about that, and I was kind of blown away by how, his description of the porticos actually matched what they found. Yeah.
And as I said, I do want to be clear that I think, that has been criticized, but I think probably the majority of people would be willing to go there who have worked on it, and certainly the person who has been the prime excavator of the pool in recent years feels very good about the identification. And incidentally, he's Jewish, so he doesn't have a horse in in the an apologetic race. He's not an evangelical trying to, or a Catholic apologist or anyone trying to make, trying to prove the gospel's right. He's just simply saying what makes the most sense historically. So.
Yeah. All right. Well, moving on to Paul's epistles. So if you are arguing for a pre-70 date for the books of the New Testament, where would that, what do you do with Paul's contested epistles? Do you think that they are written by Paul, or do you think that they're just pseudepigraphers who are writing very early, like at the same time as Paul?
I would say that I think Second Thessalonians, Ephesians, and Colossians, I think there's no really strong reason to exclude them as Pauline authorship. And actually, from Pauline authorship. And actually, I would credit your teacher, Doug Campbell, with I think his defense of their authenticity in framing Paul, I think is very strong and really. I was already leaning that way, but when I read his defense in framing Paul, that really put me over the edge. And the reason I want to really flag that is simply because I do disagree with Campbell on a number of things. I think it's very important that scholars model the fact that disagreement in one area does not exclude agreement in other areas. We can still read and profit from what someone else has written without agreeing with everything. And I think in our polarized context, that's very, very important to acknowledge. But historically, the pastoral epistles, 1 and 2 Timothy and Titus, are the most difficult, and especially for 2 Timothy and Titus, but also to a certain extent 1 Timothy. This is because really I don't think you can fit 2 Timothy and Titus into the Acts narrative. I think if they're Pauline, they have to have been written after Acts ends. I think that's just, when you get into the weeds of the details, I just don't think you can make it work. John Robinson, who wrote 50 years ago, wrote a defense wrote that every book in the New Testament is pre-70. He tries to put them in within the Acts narrative, but I just don't think he succeeds. I think he just makes crucial empirical errors that undermine the argument. 1 Timothy, you could butcher in Paul's Acts period, but I think it's a stretch. So I will acknowledge that makes them the most problematic. You have to hypothesize a post-Acts career and situate them in there. That makes it more difficult than something like Romans, that we can, there's a very clear place in Acts where we could put it. So I think, this creates problems that we have to acknowledge. Not necessarily unassailable problems, because you can hypothesize a second career, and I think a post-Acts career, and I do tend to think that's stronger than pseudepigraphy, but I will also acknowledge that they could be post-Pauline compositions.
Oh wait, sorry, that last part you said you could put them in the post-Acts. Did you say?
Well, you can, if 2 Timothy and Titus, and I think to a limited extent 1 Timothy are Pauline compositions, and they have to date after Acts, but before Paul's death. I don't think you can get away with that from that. Or they could be post-Pauline entirely. They could be something that was written, or non-Pauline, I guess. Because they could actually be the same time as Paul and still not be by Paul. But once if they're not by Paul, then of course any time becomes possible, basically.
So you are comfortable with post-70 dates for the pastoral epistles then?
I do present the possibility. In the book I present both where they're most likely if they're Pauline and where they're most likely if they're non-Pauline. And I think that's a responsible thing to do because they are the ones with the biggest question marks next to them. I don't think, I'll put it this way, I don't think the arguments against authenticity are as strong as often thought by professional scholars. I also don't think that the arguments for authenticity are as strong as Christian apologists want to think. That they could very well be Pauline compositions. They could very well be pseudo-Pauline compositions. And I think we have to acknowledge that is simply the nature of the data. The nature of the data doesn't exclude either conclusion. I would love if it did. I mean, as a historian, I'd love to be able to exclude possibilities because that narrows down what we can say. The more possibilities, the less we can say with certainty. But we also have to be honest to the material.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. Yeah. What about when we move on to other epistles like James and Jude? Do you think that these were written by Jesus's brothers, like early on in Christian history, or do you think they're written much later?
I think James, I'm very comfortable saying, was by James. I think it's very clearly, the arguments for late dating, I think, are much weaker than the arguments for early dating. I think it wouldn't surprise me if James is the oldest piece of Christian writing we have. Jude, I lean towards seeing Jude as written by the historical Jude. Again, I leave open the possibility that it's written later, but I think it is. I think strongest if it's interpreted as by Jude, which could put it into the 90s. Jude, we don't know exactly when Jude dies. He seems to be alive late. It's very potentially alive into the 90s. So, but I think he is still the most probable author.
Interesting. Yeah, I remember asking Dr. Goodacre his thoughts about the authorship of James. He said that one very interesting book was by Richard Bauckham on the Epistle of James, and that presents a strong case for authorship by James. So yeah, that's on my summer reading list as well. Because no,
absolutely. I think Richard makes a very strong argument there that I would essentially agree with. I think I'm very comfortable saying James and Jude are by James and Jude. First and Second Peter, especially Second Peter, gets more. Especially Second Peter is of course probably Second Peter. Second Peter is probably the strongest case in the New Testament for pseudepigraphal authorship. I mean, it really is in many ways very different from First Peter. So you have to explain why that is if they're both the same person. You have to accept that level of difference is acceptable within one author, or come up with some sort of better explanation. So, but again, I would, I think the arguments for an authentic Second Peter are stronger than often acknowledged by professional scholars, but also weaker than often acknowledged by by people who want it to be authentic for theological reasons. So.
Yeah, in Second Peter, the author refers to all of Paul's epistles, I think. So which seems, by some scholars seem to think that that's a reference to like a corpus of Pauline epistles. Do you think that it kind of hints that it was written relatively late, if it's already written when I guess all of Paul's epistles were collected into like, I guess, a single?
I know I'm aware that there's that position out there. I don't think it actually does, and the reason is that a couple things. First off, all of Paul's epistles. Well, what does that mean? If he's only written half of his epistles, then all of his epistles would be that half. And does it have to be referring to a collection? I don't think so. And even if it is referring to a collection, well, we don't know when the first collection happened. It's actually, ancient writers were known to collect to produce authoritative collections while they were alive. So it's not at all impossible that a collection of Paul's writings existed uh, before Paul died. And since, as far as we can tell, the latest date for Peter's death is pretty close to the latest possible date for Paul's. I don't think that particular issue speaks to the date of Second Peter, other than to say that Second Peter has to obviously post-date the earliest of Paul's letters. There has to at least be, and reasonably has to post-date not just a few letters, but a point where Paul is well known enough that Peter has to address him. This isn't being written the week after Paul's call. This is so relatively late, probably in Paul's career. But again, Paul's career probably ends around the same time as Peter's. So that's that again still opens the possibility of Peter writing on it.
Yeah. Okay. And then down to the last book, the book of Revelation, or the Apocalypse of John, where do you put that? And what arguments do you use for dating the book of Revelation?
Revelation is a fascinating book in terms of the history of its dating. That if you go back to the 19th century, basically everyone, from the most radical people like F.C. Bauer through to, what for the time would have been more conservative figures like Lightfoot, agreed that Revelation was probably written around 70, whereas today there's virtual agreement that it's in the 90s. But I think the argument for a date in the late 60s is still the strongest, and I think it has to be. I think it clearly knows about Nero's death. I think that's very clear. So it has to be after the middle of 68. But I don't think it. I think it's actually written well. I think it's very clearly written before the destruction of Jerusalem in 70. I think there's a lot of things that do not make sense after the temple has been destroyed. And so I would say it's written in that very narrow time between Nero's death and the destruction of the temple.
Can you clarify what specifically shows, in your opinion, that the author did not know about the destruction of
to me the strongest evidence of this is he talks at one point about how an earthquake will come and destroy 10% of Jerusalem. And he's presenting this as if it's the, this great climatic event that's going to come against Jerusalem. Mm-hmm. That sort of thing is very strange to me to have been written in the wake of the entire city being destroyed by war, that you would then say, oh yeah, that's bad, but 10% will be destroyed by an earthquake. Just doesn't seem, at that point it sounds almost anticlimactic. So I mean, when you get into the details, it feels to me much more like something that's written while the city still stands and someone is envisioning what horrible things might eventually happen to the city. Makes much more sense to me. Again, is it a knockdown argument? Could this stuff exist in a post-70 text? Absolutely. It just, to me, makes much more sense before 70.
Interesting. Wow. Well, very interesting. That's great how you're able to cover all of the books of the New Testament in your book. I'm super excited to read it this summer and just really delve into it as I'm continue working on my own research on the dating of the Gospels.
Well, I mean, and your research sounds very interesting. So I really wish you the best luck of that. You're focusing upon Luke Acts, which I think is great, because that's so many dating issues in the New Testament come back to the relationship to Luke Acts. That I think and I think you're probably already finding that with things like 1 Timothy 5:18. It's one small verse, just half a verse actually that's relevant, but it's a very significant piece of data that often gets overlooked. So
yeah, even if you take the pseudepigraphy of 1 Timothy for granted, and you put 1 Timothy around 1:10, it seems like the probably one of the most interesting things is that it quotes Luke as scripture. And so
Mhm.
if you assume kind of like a period of time before an author would consider Luke to be scripture, it makes it very hard to then suppose that Luke was reliant on Josephus's Antiquities of the Jews. So I feel like it might push it before Antiquities. Especially, another interesting piece of data is that Ignatius seems to have knowledge of First Timothy. So
Mhm.
depending on when you date Ignatius, you therefore get First Timothy, and then Luke, and then supposedly Josephus. And it kind of seems like there might not be enough time for each of those people to become familiar with each other's
It,
works.
I mean, what you're really getting at, especially, is, and I think you're seeing this. You're probably seeing this as you're going through, is how many variables are in play at any time. Because you have to qualify. 20 years ago, you could have said, "Oh, Josephus is writing, or Ignatius is writing during Trajan's reign." No one would have objected. Now you have to work through that, and I think rightly so. I mean, I think it's good that we're going back and we're questioning these foundations, but every time we do that, that means it opens up more variables. And
Yeah.
so I think what you're doing, though, is very timely. I think there is a lot of um, interest in revisiting the dates of the New Testament and of early Christian texts, like Ignatius. So
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I mean, even if, yeah, I know I'm gonna have to deal with the dating of Ignatius, because yeah, people have recently been redating him to like the 130s or so. So
yeah,
yeah, um, yeah, I think it's such an interesting topic because it's kind of like a literary, or at least dealing with intertextuality is like a kind of like a literary criticism, but it has so many historical implications. So that's why,
absolutely.
yeah, I find it so fascinating.
No, and it's one place where you definitely see, the old distinction between historical and literary criticism breaking down very,
Mhm.
very quickly when you really get into the weeds. So
Yeah,
it's absolutely. I think that's a very good instinct that you recognize that. So
thank you. Yeah, well, thank you so much for coming on. That was a very interesting discussion. And
thank you.
um, yeah, I'll just remind everyone to go buy his book. I've already been reading a lot of it, and it's very interesting. Yeah, thank you so much. And I hope you have a great day, and I'll talk to you again soon.
Same to you. Take care.
All right, you too. Bye.